Hey everyone, I think we're going to get started. Welcome to day 2 of Facets. Just a quick reminder, we have a COC. Please abide by the rules of our code of conduct. It is inspired by the JavaScript conference code of conduct. So just bear in mind, be aware of people's pronouns, be aware of their space. If someone doesn't want to talk, just please be respectful of that. If you feel at any point in time you're uncomfortable, someone's violated the COC, please find myself, Adele, or Bernadette. And we will try to solve the problem as quickly as possible. But now I'd like to introduce our first artist talk of the day, Lam. Lam, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Lam. That's actually part of my entire talk, but I am a German citizen who grew up to 2 Vietnamese immigrants in Frankfurt and then moved to Houston, Texas, London, New York, Hong Kong, and came back to New York. And so if you're wondering where my accent is from, that is where it is. But yeah, I am what they call a visual journalist. It's sort of like our industry is going from, as you know, from print to cable news, and now we're trying to figure out the internet, and it's kind of this slow and schlepping kind of fight against like what does and doesn't work. And so basically during my day job, I do a lot of interviewing of people. I do a lot of stories around the economy, and I try to then take all of that material and smush it into some kind of visual packaging, which is probably not a nice word for it. But I have been many iterations of this said visual journalist, and I suppose that's always been dependent on what was kind of du jour at the time. So since I started working in journalism in 2008, I was a videographer for the Wall Street Journal, which meant that I did everything but print for a print newspaper. I was a graphic artist and visual content producer for a radio station for Planet Money, which is a podcast about the economy, trying to explain dry and boring stories in interesting ways. At some point, I made them a little money printer that would be put on stage for a live show. This is my job. I was an interactive editor and a reporter for Al Jazeera America, rest in peace. And I led a team of coder reporters and told stories about poverty and social justice issues using code, using animated GIFs, using anything, or like helping my colleagues tell stories through Chrome apps. It was really, really fun. And now I'm back at a newspaper at the Wall Street Journal. I'm part of the investigations team, and I tell stories in pretty much anything but the written but the article format. And so having worked in these various spaces, I suddenly started seeing this like dichotomy in like how our industry seems to see things. And there's this thing where we look at human stories and we put them in a bucket of video and multimedia and sort of articles and so on. And then I would see these like interactive arms of news organizations, which would look into the intellectual understanding of things, which would look into the larger context of things. And quite honestly, data journalism and news applications developers have become this kind of like really trendy thing in newsrooms, and everyone's looking for them, everyone's trying to hire for them. But one of the things that I always found really weird is that there is this divide between emotional and human storytelling and intellectual and contextualized storytelling. And I really felt conflicted because I came from 3 years of working in video and 3 years of going to places like Japan after the earthquake and like talking to people on the ground and talking to them what it was like to have lost a city that was already maybe on its way out, and like whether they wanted to rebuild or not, and then going into this realm where everyone's like, the economy, it's all about numbers and so on. But that's not necessarily just the only way of looking at numbers. And so I wanted to prove to myself and other people that this is not a true statement and that people can be found in data. And to prove that to myself at some point, I wanted to start talking about more like what data actually is and what data are, whatever you adhere to, whether it's are or it is. And I wanted to talk about how you can mine emotional and heartbreaking and powerful stories within data. And I want to go on a quest with you to find the human in the spreadsheet. And so with that, I wanted to start with a very basic point. It's the data point. This is I think these are all donors to a political campaign, and I just kind of looked into a general spreadsheet, and I at some point, a good friend of mine, she worked in data journalism for a long time. She said something really, really lovely to me that kind of blew my mind and made me rethink what data was. And she said, data is basically an interview done over and over and over again on a massive scale by someone else with thousands of people, right? And so if you think about it this way, you go from the census is nothing but a giant interview in a piece of paper, right? It's being sent out to everyone, and then you can say, well, my name is this, and then I'm a foreign-born immigrant to America. My descent is Asian American, or Asian at this point, Vietnamese, and I'm female. I live in a single household. I live in Brooklyn. All of those things are interviews that someone took, compiled, summarized, and then put into a spreadsheet. And so, if we think about it this way, like data is kind of getting at the fundamental part of nonfiction storytelling. It comes down to the interview. And if you think of data as an interview done on a massive scale with individuals, then data in a spreadsheet in its rawest form is a bunch of people. And so one specific row could represent a human being. And in this case, just for argument's sake, that could be me. About 2 years ago now, and I want to show you how this all relates to something, I used this way of thinking of myself as a data point to cope with heartbreak. I was going through a divorce, and on March 19th, 2014, I had become one of 147,451 divorcees in Brooklyn. That's a lot. That day, I went from being like a legally married woman to being legally divorced, which was quite a lot to take in, because you kind of go through these processes, you separate it, and then you kind of put in like 10 sheets of paper, you sign all this stuff, and then at some point, this email arrives, and it's your lawyer saying, "Well, you're divorced." Sent from an iPhone. And you're like, oh, okay, that was a pretty big thing. And I sat in my room and I was like, holy fuck, this is pretty big news, and I'm all by myself. How am I dealing with this? How should I cope with this? And the way I wanted to cope with this, because this is what I did in my job, was to actually start looking into the data of it. And so it's like, I am not alone. There must be other divorcees in Brooklyn. And so this little pink speck is me, and then all of that. Also other divorcees just in my borough alone. That means I'm not the only one. Yay. Right? So that was sort of like one of the many graphics I actually did for a blog called Quantify Breakup. Because, you know, when people like us go through heartbreak and hardship, we start coding. And we start looking into the data. We start finding ways to express that. And so this, for example, this is the blog that I started doing. It was kind of like a series of blog posts around how I felt at that given point in time. And I wanted to look through those spreadsheets to find indications of how I was doing better or not. And it was actually quite surprising how many emotions I was able to mine from my data. There were different methodologies that I used that were really scientific, but eventually it all came down to the same question, like, how was I doing at that point in time? And this, for example, is a graphic about 3 months of retail therapy. How was I doing? I don't know. I was trying to buy myself happy, right? I don't know who else has done this here before. Go on to like shopping binges, especially online, when you have like Amazon at your fingertips at 3 o'clock in the morning, like wiping your tears off, looking at fountain pens that are $87. That's what I did. I bought a synthesizer that I've never used, again, sadly, which I should. It was kind of broken anyway, some Craigslist. I bought a lot of clothes. There was a backpack. I also organized the spreadsheets because, again, you have a lot of time on your hands when you're suddenly single, into useless things and useful things. There was a backpack that he took that I bought, and I thought that was really great. I bought myself like a stupidly expensive fountain pen. What else is there? a plant that I hadn't killed yet, but I think at this point I have killed it. And then some nerdy necklaces, some shoes, all of that stuff. It was kind of like a way for me to fumble around and figure out the question, how am I doing at the given point in time? Because for me, the way to cope with this kind of stuff was to work and to like figure it out in a scientific way, even though I was feeling like shit the entire time. Sorry. Anyhow, there was also then, as I got better, there was this lovely process of like, wait, is it this? Oh yeah, this was a thing where I was just trying to figure out. So when you are by yourself in your apartment that you used to share with someone, you start feeling anxious, right, after the breakup. So there was a lot of me trying to process like what I was doing to cope with this. This is a bike ride that I took on a Saturday night because everyone else was having fun and I didn't know whether I wanted to go out and drink. And so I jumped on my bike and just kind of like rode, had no idea where I was going, and then came back from Chinatown into Brooklyn. There were 3 maps like that. There was one where I was sitting on a subway and was like, you know what? I'm just not gonna get up. I'm just gonna sit on this train and feel like shit and like cry to myself for a long time. And there were 3 maps that I did that were very similar. Running around in circles, I call it, because oftentimes when you feel all this anxiety and you're by yourself, that is what you do. You need to get this energy out, right? And so looking at the geolocation data that I had was an interesting way. I mined my phone for that. There's a surprising amount of information on your phone. Yes, the FBI has figured out a way of cracking that. And yes, there will be a lot of information that you can show, that they can find about you, but maybe also emotional states, right? And then there's this lovely thing that happens after a while once you like, take those 6 to 10 months or however long it takes to get back into the game, and you go out and do online dating. All right. Who here has done online dating? Who here feels like super awkward about it? Me. And so you do this weird dance on your phone, right, where you start text messaging. And like these are all the text messages I exchanged with online dates. You can tell like, oh yeah, someone was 5, 38 messages, 41 messages, 5th person, and then whoa, 1,249 messages in less than 4 weeks. That's a lot. That guy was like totally ghosting me afterwards because he was just like, I'm all in. And then it was like, oh no, I have cold feet. But but this was a way for me to like see like, oh, okay, this is what it's like when you actually hit it off with someone. And this is what it looks like when you do that. Wait. Bam! This was an interesting experiment for me because I had never seen the emotional potential in data. But if you think about it, under every data point is backed by human action. Someone texted this. Someone actually sent a text and created that data point that is now accessible through forensic software. And if you think about it this way, Facebook, the gadgets that we use, online services, our phone become the first like documentation of the history of our own story. And so when I started seeing that, I was like, oh my goodness, I could mine so many different kinds of emotional human stories and finally marry the world of like multimedia and human-based stories with like the intellectual and contextual storytelling that I loved so much through data reporting. And so you can find a narrative arc and a story within that. I think there's a lot of like talk around data as a fad, as this thing where you have a lot of it and suddenly you have a story. And I'm like, no, you need to figure out what it is, what stories, what questions you want to go after, and then paint that story from the beginning of a breakup to the middle of a breakup of feeling like shit to the end of it, hopefully hitting it off with someone that didn't work out. But still, like it's the idea of finding a narrative arc within this spreadsheets that you yourself produce with your behavior. That's the kind of stuff that I'm really, really interested in at this point in time. And so I started using this kind of stuff in my day job. I started looking into data in general, and I found out that according to an MIT study, the average office worker produces about 5 gigabytes worth of data every day by just behaving like the way they would, using their phones, using their computers, emailing, shifting one file to another folder, etc. All of that stuff produces 5 gigabytes worth of data every single day about your behavior. That's crazy. That means that you're leaving a digital footprint for someone to either use and abuse, as you can see with some of the ways in which politicians use this data, in which criminal, the police department uses that data to maybe predict crimes, etc., to political messaging that happens on a much more personalized level based on your data. But you can also, if you want to reclaim that data and kind of make it your own, hope to find stories within that hopefully bedazzle you, show you a human side as well. And so if you think about it this way, the way people talk to each other and how they maintain friendships, family ties, and relationships is increasingly moving into the electronic realm, right? I Skype with my mom. She's in Germany. My brother lives in Saigon, and we talk a lot over Skype, WhatsApp, and all of these things. And there is this digital footprint of the love that we send to each other. Twitter records the thoughts of 305 million people, and one thing that I've realized, sadly, because Facebook is not the most open network, but basically Facebook touts 1.59 billion active users every month. And I have taught in Myanmar, I have taught in Pakistan, and I've taught in all of these other places, and Facebook is like the internet for a lot of developing nations, for a lot of people, for a lot of immigrants, for a lot of people who kind of like try to maintain friendships. I was able to find, while I was working at Al Jazeera, a refugee who found his friend from when he was 9 years old, because suddenly the refugee camps in Nepal, he was a Bhutanese refugee, had internet connection. And then they found each other on Facebook. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. This is connecting 1.59 billion people, right? And then this is how people might be talking to each other. This is a son talking to his mother. We looked at the story for a story we did for Al Jazeera America. And the mother in question is this woman, Salia Ben Ali. She was a source that my colleague Lisa DeBode interviewed for a story about mothers. And Ben Ali was the mother of a 19-year-old man. I'm going to show you this chat again. Of a 19-year-old guy who was radicalized. He grew up in Belgium, and then he became an extremist, and he fought with an extremist group in Syria. But after he left, she spent 6 weeks begging for him to come home this way. They exchanged more than 2,000 messages, and she pleaded him to abandon his newfound role as a martyr, oftentimes 3 times a day. And this shows you a way of communicating. This shows you something that's really emotional. This is in the data that she gave us, screenshot by screenshot, but still it's an expression of emotional ties and humanizes people who are usually only seen as victim or perpetrators, right? And this is incredible to see. She gave us like a few more conversations they had. He talks about how he goes to the market and gets honey to like put on his wounds and everything. It's an incredibly human way of entering a space. And we all are familiar with the way the story is told because we use it every day, right? The way we communicate is through pictures. The way we communicate in chats is this way. And then when you see your own self transposed onto the point of view of these two people, you hopefully can feel what they feel, and you hopefully can see what they see. And this is all, again, a record of history of other people's stories. The first one that is out there, living in the cloud, right? Or in a data center somewhere, wherever Facebook has its data centers. I don't know. Someone knows this. And so, again, telling these stories with these snippets can be so immersive. Many of us know these interfaces, and many of us can see chats like that on a daily basis. Let me show you another example. So this is, and I will go really quickly so that it doesn't stay on the screen. This was the Facebook data of a guy called Jeffrey Ngo. He is a student, he is an exchange student at NYU, and he's actually originally from Hong Kong. 2015, 2015. When was it? You guys know that in Hong Kong there were like these 10-week-long like occupations of the streets. There were a lot of pro-democracy protests, and at some point the police threw tear gas at these students, right? And so what happened was that was that he was so incited by what happened abroad, but he was at his hometown, that he really wanted to participate in this political movement. And so he gave me access to his Facebook account, because that's how he organized all of these political protests, right? They staged, I think, 80-something protests around the world in solidarity with the Hong Kong movement. It rings very true with a lot of other social justice movements in the US right now, right? And in many ways, the ways in which he organized this is probably very similar to how many other political movements kind of spring up. So we see through 98.3 megabytes of data, which doesn't sound like much, but Facebook doesn't give it to you in the friendliest of all things. It gives you a nice little website that you have to scrape and like figure out. We went through roughly 15,000 lines of code to extract the 28,545 messages that Jeffrey had exchanged with his one organizer, Angel Leong. So Angel was she's an activist from the Hong Kong side. They met on Facebook, and when I asked him, hey, do you remember the first time you talked to her? He said, oh, no. He couldn't recall what their first conversation was about, but thanks to this data, we were able to.
So we began having Facebook conversations, groups, and then everything had just gone on from there. There isn't really anything like we officially found an organization like that. It's mostly people joining in. Through connections over connections and connections, I was added to a number of different sort of Facebook groups, and we began talking. We began to introduce, each person says, oh, I'm from Vancouver, or I'm from Toronto, I'm from San Francisco, and I'm from New York. So we began to to talk, and Angel was one of the people who were in Hong Kong.
Sorry. All right, that was actually it. I'm sorry about that. But basically, we were able to reconstruct the first chat they had based on based on the data he gave us, right? It's an interesting way of like recreating moments and having you relive them, especially something that's very exciting for video, because when you're making a video, if you weren't there when something unfolded, if you weren't there when something happened, you can't recreate it easily unless you're like doing a lot of animation or something like that. So it was an interesting exercise of that. And what's also interesting is that we were able to graph out how this movement came about. So you can see that the numbers of chat messages that they exchanged skyrocketed when the Hong Kong police threw tear gas at the students. And that's when people kind of sprung to action. But what you can also see is the beige line. That is a chat room that emerged out of that. And that's the chat room where all the leaders came out of, right? The leaders of this international movement who are still active outside of the people who were just first part of the whole movement. And so you can see, what you can see here is actually the pattern of a political movement. What do actions look like at the beginning when you see something that outrages you and that makes you passionate about something, and then who sticks around and how does it go in ebbs and flows? How does it go up and down depending on how much work people have to do? How do they maintain that momentum over time? And it was like a very lovely way of like understanding how Jeffrey fit into the entire microcosm of this global movement that happened online. And as we see more and more activism, more and more sort of groups and communities form online, this is where we can find those stories. This is where we can find the material to retell those stories, right? Anyhow, nowadays, so given this is sort of like how it flew, like how personal data came into my day job. Now I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out the most compelling stories that I can tell through data, and I started a project called Quantified Selfie. Again, it's the idea that we are some of the biggest producers of data out there right now, 5 gigabytes of data every day. And what I'm trying to do is to figure out whether we can find traces of who we are online in an emotional and more profound way, right? So I spent my time doing things like figuring out how to scrape my friend's mailbox account. She gave me access to her entire Gmail archive to look into basically what kinds of emails still lurk in her mailbox from her ex-boyfriends. One of the most interesting concepts that's happened with the internet is that we've gone from a default of forgetting to a default of remembering. There's a book by Victor Schoenberger, I think is his name. It's called Delete. And it's the idea that digital storage is so cheap that we have all of this digitally assisted remembering that kind of can haunt us if we want to for a long time, right? There's a trace of all of us. It can be dangerous, as is the case with maybe Justine Sacco, who made this very unfortunate joke before she went on a plane to South Africa about HIV and how she didn't get it because she was white. And then she is now haunted for it forever. There's a book that Ron Johnson wrote about it called So You've Been Shamed, right? What does this mean when we can't erase our past? What does it mean on an individual level when we can't erase all the people that were part of us at some point? What does it mean when our memory, which is in itself a creative act, remembering is reconstructing in your head and retelling that story, iteration after time, right? It changes with each time you remember something. What does it mean when we cannot create that memory, when we go back and have to relive it in the way it was? And so I wanted to look into that, and basically Allison gave me access to a friend, Allison, whose last name shall be anonymous, gave me access to her entire Gmail archive. And I looked into all of the emails from her exes. This was from 6 years, I guess, 7 years-ish, and you can see the story of the guy who never disappeared. The on-again, off-again dude who kind of comes up and comes back. You can see stories of like intense communications each time of like relationships. And then you can also see that this is kind of like a Pandora's box. All of the emails that you have are like this way and this rabbit hole that you can go into and feel very awkward and weird about once you start rereading them. And it's something that you only open. She says that's only something that she opens when she has a glass of wine and feels really sad and like lonely at some point in time. And she sees like she happens upon an email when she searches for them, or she happens upon a Facebook photo of them getting married or something like that, right? We all know this like rabbit hole. We all have felt like, have seen an email and be like, I remember this, and reread certain parts of it, maybe the strings and so on. And this sort of weird catharsis, this weird like way of like experiencing memory again and experiencing those relationships again, this digitally assisted remembering is something that I found particularly fascinating when I talked to her. Anyhow. I'm still doing these things, so the next one that hasn't published yet, I tried to finish it up yesterday night, but I was just too tired. This is a story that I'm doing about my friend Stephanie. She's a radio producer, and she's a audiophile, and she loves to build her own soundtrack for her a daily commute, for her life in many ways, because audio is such a big part of her life. And so I asked her to give me access to all of her musical data. So this is her first year in New York, as survived with music, with assistance from her favorite artists. And you can see here, breakups seem to be a big thing for me, but this is where her boyfriend leaves her and just like, he doesn't just dump her. She comes back from a vacation, her apartment is empty, and he leaves a note. We all hate him, but that's okay. And like this woman, like courageously, like pummels through this, and then comes out loving New York and herself even more. And those are the kinds of stories that I want to tell. She basically, the yellow dots are mixed feelings, blue dots are sad feelings, and pink dots are happy feelings, right? And so there is a way of telling a story with a beginning, middle, and end with data. There is a way to look through the noise and not make it all about like, look at all of this data that I have, right? Like I think we've come to a next point in the game where we need to find a narrative in the data, where we need to find interesting insights anomalies, trends, things that make you jaw drop, things that make you go, oh, or oh my God, right? Like all of that stuff is lurking in the personal repositories of our actions. And yeah, I'm really excited about continuing to do this. And if you want to, we can talk after this talk and we can make a quantified selfie together at some point. All right? All right. Thanks. We have time now, right?
Hi, everyone. So that was an amazing talk. I guess let's open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions to ask Lam?
Yes,
Oh.
please.
I have a question about Facebook.
Uh-huh.
So you talked about how it's not open source, or it's not one of the most open source applications, and I wonder, like, are you worried about, like, when you get locked out of your Facebook and you have all your data there, like, is that a thing that people are worrying about, like what happens when people get locked out and how Facebook can sort of like push you out of all this data that you've sort of created and over years?
Right. So the access that Facebook gives you is about your own data. So you can download that entire history. I think they started doing that once they had a lot more pressure on them with people being like, oh, privacy and so on. I think one of the reasons why Facebook is valued at such a high level is because it has behavioral data about you over time, which is basically like a multi-billion-dollar marketing study that you can use to do whatever you want. And I think that's the issue, right? Like I think there are a lot of people who are out there and trying to figure out whether we can have a data bill of rights. What data belongs to those companies, what data doesn't. And it's not just Facebook who does it. It's just Facebook is like one of the most like the biggest companies out there, but there are data brokers out there who have taken all of that public data about you, bundle it up and sell it to marketers and stuff like that.
I find that data actually through AdSpace.
Yeah, there you go.
The names are crazy, like Corporate Clouder, City Mixer, Metro Mixer. That was
Right.
one of the. It's like very dystopian, these titles that they want
Right.
to do.
And the interesting thing is that that we don't have any, like, I am a big believer of regulating these kinds of things, right? Like in Europe, you have this like blanket policy that says if it's infringing on your privacy, you need to have the right to be forgotten. I don't think in the U.S. that exists. I think privacy, from what I've remembered, like covering it, is regulated on a federal basis. So state by state, sometimes local, like municipality, local municipality. Like I did a story about a private detective, for example, who has access to forensic software because he's licensed in New Jersey that other people who are licensed somewhere else might not have, right? And he can go back on your computer and do all this fun stuff and find out pretty much everything around you. But until we have some sort of like legal, like there's the only thing that we have is the right to privacy. I think this is the Second Amendment, if I'm not wrong. And it's sort of like you have a reasonable right to privacy, unless there's a warrant out for you, and then they can search the crap out of you. But that is never enough to protect your metadata, right? It's enough to protect, let's take an email. It's enough to protect the contents of your email, because that's like a wiretapping almost, like it's taking parts of your conversation and putting them somewhere. But things like when the email was sent, what links were in the email, I think the subject line and so on, all of those things are not protected by those laws. And I think until we have something that's interesting, like sort of looks into what data rights we have as the data producers, I don't think there's something that is holistically like taking care of our privacy. And I think one of the interesting things is that then you make a choice, and everyone has had to make that choice of like, do I opt in for the sake of having an easier life, right? Like, do I let Uber have my the location data so that I can have a cab wherever I am in the world and whenever I want to, right? Like, is it more important for me to protect my privacy or to have convenience of like a modern gadget-driven life? Like, what is it that I want? And I think I don't know the right answer to those questions. What I do know is that I want to, like, one of the things that I do like about quantified selfie is that it makes people freak out a little bit. Like, they're like, whoa, that's so much, I didn't know, and so on. And there's this, like, weird and interesting, uncomfortable space that I also want to push people into so that they understand there is so much about you out there, and I can find it. And I'm just a stupid little journalist who's, like, here, like, sometimes doing it in her spare time. Imagine what people could do if they were dedicated to this full time, right? And so So there's always this like little creepiness that I want to infuse into my project so that people may think about these kinds of issues at some point. Yes, please.
There was I remember reading recently about how teenagers and preteens use Facebook and the way they will create an account, post, then disable the account. And sort of push going towards a larger trend of things like Snapchat that are much more private. How do you feel about the sort of like pendulum swing here with we're in the generation where we're sort of figuring this out for ourselves, and the other generation is sort of being a little more privacy conscious?
Yeah. I think what's still going to happen is that in many ways, as data moves more and more electronically, there are certain things you can opt out from the social perspective, but there's certain things you cannot opt out of, right? Like from bank accounts to going electronic to like, what else is there? I mean, like there are databases now around like migration and so on, where you registered and how you registered and so on. A lot of this stuff is moving into the electronic realm. And what's interesting as well is that, let's say, 10 years ago, right, cookies were a big deal. You would always see this thing pop up that says, just be aware, we're using cookies on the side. Have you seen that recently in any of the American websites? No, right? It's interesting because it's still a big deal in Germany. I was just in Germany like a week ago, and you would see it pop up in a browser and be like, just be aware, we're still using cookies and so on. I think there's certain parts that you can definitely like conscientiously opt out of, which kids do. Like the thing that you're saying about Facebook is definitely happening on Snapchat. If you have read the very amusing and wonderful article on BuzzFeed around Snapchat, where a guy asked his 14-year-old sister to explain Snapchat to him. Do you remember her and I'm sorry?
I still don't understand it.
Yeah, I know, exactly. But these kids, like, they amass like so many points or something. I didn't even know there was a pointing and scoring system on Snapchat, and then they just like kill it like straight away afterwards. And it's an interesting thing of also like the shelf life of digital like records on some level. What companies are going to survive also then determines what data is going to survive about you, right? Like Google's probably not going to go under anytime soon. I don't know. Maybe not. But like MySpace was the biggest deal between 2005 and 2008. I just did a little timeline about it. Like I looked into all of these like digital like companies that sprung up and like have seen like a very quick and unfortunate death, and with that the data disappears. I'm right now doing a project about a friend of mine about her life journals, that kind of stuff. How long is it going to survive? How long is it going to be there, and so on. And also one of the things that I remember reading in an article or like listening to in a talk where someone said, when we look at a scrap of paper, or when we have a scrap of paper that we throw away, at least we look at it. There's all of this stuff on the internet, all these URLs that are dying every single day, and a lot of these like servers that are dying every single day that we don't look at. So it's an interesting, weird, like microcosm that is not really regulated, and there's no rhyme or reason to how people are archiving, how people are killing certain things, like certain websites and not. And I think there's definitely something to be seen that's gonna. I feel like it's like this weird virus that kind of like grows out some parts and arms and tentacles, and then other parts die off and so on. It's just like this weird ecosystem. And there's no way to predict what's going to be preserved because, again, MySpace. I think Jolly had a question.
Yeah, I wanted to nitpick with you about Europe because
Sure.
while the right to be forgotten is from the search engines,
Yes.
to be disappeared from the search engines.
Oh, the government gets to do whatever they
have
want.
data retention laws, which are the exact opposite of that.
Right,
You know,
right.
So, but I thought she made a very good point about what happens if you're blocked. You know, say under the real names
Right.
policy, you get blocked from something for to have access back to your data, to have some avenue of appeal beyond the terms of use of the company.
I wonder whether, I don't know the laws around that, but there must be a way of like, for government institutions, you can FOIA the information that is out there about you, the Freedom of Information Act. But I think for Facebook, who knows? Like that's the problem, right? Like we don't know whether they have to abide by any rules or whether you have any claim or right to your data given.
Terms of use, that's
Yeah, exactly. Terms of service. Once you use it, it's.
Sort of jumping off of that.
Sure.
In Europe, with these right to be forgotten laws, would there ever be a point, do you think, in the future where you'd have a lot of right to be remembered?
I wonder, yeah.
So where you're like, oh, I really want to
Preserve those archives.
Yeah, and as a human, I get to have a Facebook account.
I-
Like that.
I think what's happened for that is that people are now, like, LiveJournal allows you to download your data as CSVs. So does Twitter. So does, and Facebook gives you like a customized website. I think that's the only, like, we go back to like hard drives, right? Like, that's what you can have. And I think beyond that, because it's a private like entity, there's no accountability in terms of like what happens to the data, and even sometimes how securely it's stored, as you can see by the tons and tons of like leaks of data that's happened in the past. So I don't know if there's going to be a law like that, but it's definitely an interesting thing to think about. Yes, please. Yes, please.
I wanted to go back to the thought about like the death of servers or something.
Yeah.
I was just thinking of like there was this World of Warcraft server that like was shut down recently, and on the day that it was shut down, there was this like really beautiful event where like everyone who was a character in the thing like got into this one area, and they were all like doing like a bunch of spells. So it was like this really massive thing, and then the server just kind of like shut down. And I just wanted to think about like how the death of some servers is kind of humanizing, because then you realize, like, okay, like this thing can live and die, and that's like me as a human will live and die, whatever.
That event sounds awesome.
But then also like thinking about like using the data from like Gmail or Facebook, and like thinking about the emotions of that, like in my mind, like Gmail and Facebook will like never die or something. Like they've been around like my whole life, and I just
but who knows, man?
I know that, but that's like that's the weird thing that like if you're looking at all the emotional data, is that sort of like replacing the death? That's a really crazy question probably, but I don't know.
Right. Or now we're also facing the first time of like what happens after you die, right? Like the idea of remembrance and the idea of like what happens to your like accounts and stuff like that. Those are all really interesting questions around like the lifespan of a company and the lifespan of you as a human, right?
Yeah, and there's like this whole thing about like people who have passed away as Facebook users. And that weird sort of ghost thing.
It is, and I mean, I see it a lot. There are always sometimes on birthdays, people come back up on that. People will post like memorials sometimes, and there are people who, I know someone who unfortunately was hit by a big truck, and she's been paralyzed and sort of like trying to regain her life. And every year, like she's still alive and she's kind of recuperating. It's been taking a lot of years, but like every few years there'll be like, or every few months there'll be like a post missing you and stuff like that. It's an interesting space for human like accumulation in that sense. Yes, please.
Yeah, just building off that, it's like I thought it's thinking about this recently, that this idea of sort of like we think of the internet as permanent, but really we think of things as permanent, but like, you know, it's just data on a server there that could be gone at any time.
Right.
And it's just funny because on the one hand, like I always thought of like MySpace Music as like where I kept archives of my old bands, but all of the MP3s are gone now.
Yeah.
Like the pages are still up, but there's no music. And that's one that I kind of wish were still around. But then on the other hand, my old Angel Fire page from when I was 16, the index.html is still there. Everything else is gone, but the index.html has all the most obnoxious stuff that I wrote at 16. And it's like, why? And I wish that was. But just, I don't know, it's funny how we sort of think of these things as time capsules, sometimes for better or worse, but like it's just kind of this illusion.
And we've also gotten lazier about preserving it, right? Because we think it's there.
Preserving it or scrubbing it in the case that we want to.
And also with every technological upgrade, we lose things too. I learned Flash in grad school.
Yeah.
Gosh darn it! Like half of my projects are done, and it's only been 8 years, right? Like that's crazy. You had a question.
Yeah. I was wondering if you had thought about maybe consequences of maybe like more widespread use of like quantified selfies. Let's say there's this, maybe this already exists, but like a service where you can go dump in all your personal CSVs.
Yeah.
It maps out your whole life, and then you can kind of go back and like relive things as they were exactly. Have you had maybe like unintended consequences of that?
Yes. Because like what often happens is like there's certain things you don't want to reopen, right? And in terms of like one of the things that I want to figure out more, right now the way I'm working is I'm taking the data and I'm making sure that it's safe on my local space, and then the only thing I push to GitHub, the only things I put out are really sanitized processed like versions of the data, and I make sure that no one's like harmed within that. Like, but the biggest thing that's happened now is like, especially in the realm of journalism or even politics or even storytelling, is the personalization through those things. I'm going to show you something real fast if you have time. It's one of my favorite examples to like show people. I tried to show this to you yesterday about how creepy Facebook can be. This is, if we have a little bit of time, it's a little loud. Maybe.
We definitely have some time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this is a project that connects to your Facebook and then puts personalizes a story for you. This is my favorite thing. It's also like creepy. If the API were still working, you could see a Google map here. Friendly PSA. This is a friend of mine actually. They're like, this person's next. This is a friendly PSA for you to recognize that your data is up for grabs sometimes, and there's easy ways that it can be grabbed to do interesting storytelling experiments like that, but also be like used by a weird man in a tank top, like to find you, right? But yeah. I find this I have no answers because I always feel like I know nothing. Oh, yay. But I also feel like there is something to be said about getting people to think about these issues and getting people to think about what is out there about yourself and like what the unintended consequences of that could be. And the biggest thing that I want to figure out next is an ethical framework, especially for journalists, to like figure out what it means to elevate a tweet, right? What it means to feature Justine Sacco's stupid joke, admittedly, but then to ruin the rest of her life. What are the ethical implications of that? Just because it's public doesn't mean it's public, right? Like, and then I also want to figure out like a framework of doing this kind of stuff securely. What are the best encryption methods? What are the best tools that people can use to do this kind of storytelling? But yeah, two things I can contribute. Thanks.
I think we still have time for
Oh, yeah.
one or two more questions. Does anyone have any?
My clock is fast.
I have a weird comment. You know, you're talking about these memories. Who here has had that Facebook horrible 5-year, 2-year,
Oh yeah.
6-year, 10-year, whatever recall? It just happened to me 2 days ago. It just reminded me of my dog, my picture of my dog. And my dog died like 2 years ago.
Jeez.
And I'm looking at Facebook and I just burst into tears because there's this gorgeous picture of my dog there, and I like wanted to throw the computer out the window. I want to be reminded about these things. I
Right.
think that Facebook does that. I wonder what you think about that.
What do I think about that?
Yeah, about how Facebook uses that memory.
I actually hate it myself because it's like it's not controlled, and suddenly you're like thrust into like an emotional space that you weren't ready or prepared to be in, right?
Right.
You yes, and then
I was reading that was developed because people were posting less personal information.
Yeah.
Personal links between people.
Yeah.
And that they wanted to like the memories was encouraged to like
make you reshare it with people that you're like personally connected to, so they could get better like data.
That to me is just as creepy as that.
Yeah. You may know more about that. Your tweet I read.
I'm sorry.
You had another question?
Oh, I was just back to thinking about Facebook activism and as you were studying these movements. So a lot of like people I know that work with Facebook activism, sometimes their accounts get frozen because like maybe someone reports something they said,
Right.
and then I've been noticing people have like hashtags for them like free so and so because they're Facebook, and I wonder does Facebook see, like does that help them get their Facebook back? Like, do you know if like Facebook even considers that, or like is that just like what we understand as a language? Because it's kind of like talking about as if they've been imprisoned because they can't touch their Facebook account because it's silencing them.
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, like they do have a code of conduct, and I think oftentimes reported. Like if enough people report it, Facebook will maybe. I don't know what the backbone is of their moral ideals behind that, but they do like take action in that way, and I think it would be interesting to look into who is doing that to whom, right? Like there are certain things that you definitely don't want it. There's like people who are dedicated to shutting down like child pornography on like Facebook and so on, who sit there every day and look at that. Now they have a cadre of people on social media that fight terrorism apparently, like and they sit there and like delete certain and close certain accounts and so on. It's the idea of like this process, is it algorithmic for people who are not necessarily like gonna perpetuate child pornography, like, or is it actually a human being making those decisions? And that's also an interesting thing that I would love to understand better, how that happens behind the scenes, so that we can understand who makes those moral judgment calls and who do they represent, like, right? Whose like interests do they represent? Who gets to make that judgment call? Is it someone who gets paid on an hourly basis, on a contract basis every few like months and like sits there and is like, okay, nope, and then shuts everything off? Or is it actually something that's like really thought around and thought about? That probably would be a good story. There we go. Yes, please.
There was a prison abolitionist, someone who, I guess they became more woke, they became a prison abolitionist, but then some leftists had done some digging and found that they had tweeted, that Manning should have been imprisoned when it all first came out, and then they tried to use that against them. But I think it's really interesting. You have to like think maybe contextually when you see data like that, that this person now is woke or whatever,
right?
And they're trying to do the right thing now. And then, but if you look back a few years, they did say, throw away the key, throw Manning in jail.
Right.
But to be more forgiving to each other.
Right. The idea of redemption, does that come into place? Can you not reinvent, but do you get a second chance if you've taken a few missteps online? Yeah. That's actually what the whole book, John runs, and so you've been, I think it's called, So You've Been Shamed Online or something like that, is about the idea of like, do we get to have a second chance? And the same with the book Delete, which is all about like, if in an era where we cannot forget, is that fair? Is that something that we are not supposed to, like, how does it rejigger society in many ways? And sort of the witch hunt that happens oftentimes. Together with, like, we have these wonderful, like, hurrah, we're together, it's a wonderful communities, but we also have, like, these ugly sides of, like, humanity come and like, come down like a hawk and so on. Like, and it's interesting to have those coexist in many ways, right? What does this mean for, like, social dynamics on the platforms that we use to conduct our lives these days? Questions I can't answer.
Thank you.
All right. We have any time?
I think, we could probably do maybe like one more question if it's short.
One short question.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Real quick. One interesting thing about deletion is that a lot of database design is sort of created in a way where you don't actually delete anything. What you do is you just deactivate the record. So a lot of this stuff we think is deleted
It's there.
might still be there.
Yeah.
So, I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
I mean, like, that's the issue, right? Like, behavioral data over time, you need all of these people to make that work as a marketing machine, as a way of making money. That is why Facebook is, again, valued so highly in terms of, like, as a potential, like money-making machine and so on. And so if you think about it in this way, that is in their interest to do that. Right. I don't know. I would argue, again, until we have, like, a bill of, like, data rights in that sense. Like, there is nothing that legally makes companies like that delete certain things, right? And that's the issue, and that's the problem, and that's sort of something that I find interesting. Regardless of where we end up with what law, I do feel like we need to address it somehow. And there are some initiatives in that realm. I think they're sort of like piecemeal, but maybe the EFF does some stuff around that a little bit. But yeah, I have no idea. Yay. Great. Thank you.